Welcome back to the second half of Lab 3. This is a review session for the students in my Unity 1 course, the APL STEM Academy. Although for anyone who's come across this, you should be able to just pick up and work along. If you remember from the first half of the lab, what we're doing here is we are setting up the very basics of an infinite runner. So what we have is we have this red cube that's the stand-in for our player, and we're going to have sideways scrolling obstacles that we have to jump over. And so far, what we did in the first half of the lab was we set it up so that our player can jump on the press of a key. We're doing that jump using a force application instead of simple translation. So now we're actually relying on gravity and physics simulation to do our jumping. And we're detecting when we land on the ground to make sure we're allowed to jump again and not allowing our player to jump multiple times in midair. Now that we've gotten to that point, another part that you want to have in a lot of games oftentimes is it's useful to have a score, especially in a game like this. Oftentimes you'll track how far you've run for a score. In our case, we're going to keep track of how many times we successfully jumped over an object. And this is mostly an introduction so that we can learn how to work with UI for the first time, because up to this point in the first two labs, we've never really used a UI to keep track of a game score or anything like that. So what we're going to be covering today is creating a UI, and then going a little bit more in depth on what it looks like to link across scripts. We haven't done a lot of interaction between scripts before, but in this case, we're going to need to be telling our UI when we've scored a point so that it can update. So off camera, I went ahead and set up a basic spawn manager and a basic hurdle object for us to jump over. Nothing too complicated. We're just going to have every few seconds, you should see a bar spawn in. It'll slide from the right to the left, and you can jump over the top of it. I'm not going to cover this in this recap because it's part of Lab 2. You did something very similar, so I will leave it to you to review how to create these spawns. But now we have something to hurdle over and keep track of our score. And you can see it collides with our player if I let it. What we need to be able to do, though, is keep track of how many of those we've jumped over. So our basic scoring system for now is just going to be 1 point for every hurdle we successfully go over. To do that, we need to have a UI. And if I open up this drop-down UI here, you can see that one of our categories that we haven't used yet is actually UI. Inside of that, you have a lot of different options. And in this case, we're going to want to go with this Text Mesh Pro. There is a basic text here. I recommend using Text Mesh Pro. It's got a little bit more complicated features and control. Doesn't really matter, but that's what I most often use. So if you select that, if you've never done this before in your project, it's going to prompt you to import TMP, Text Mesh Pro. Go ahead and hit import on that. Once that finishes loading, you'll notice that we've added a few things to our hierarchy here. Unlike most time where you only end up with one object created, it's pre-generated a few different things for us. In this case, the text that we've actually added is nested under something called a canvas. And it also created this event system for us. We're not going to worry about that too much right now, but the event system is another part of how Unity manages UI. So the first time you add a UI element, it's going to generate that for you. This canvas here, you might even see down on my game window, you've got a little tiny peeking out thing that says new text, which if I select my text object is what's currently listed in this box. But you may also notice, it might be kind of hard to see, there's this box here, and if I zoom way out, so there it says new text, and if I just keep zooming out, there is my canvas for the UI. It's gigantic, but it weirdly does live inside of the game scene. And the reason it's so huge is that the way Unity is going to handle UI in this case is it's overlaying this object in the world onto your camera. So the size of it in your game space is actually 1 unit, 1 meter per pixel on the screen down here. So if my screen was 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, my game window, this would be 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters within the game world. So actually, it might be kind of hard to tell because it'll resize both screens, but if I stretch this window up and down, it's changing the shape of my canvas in the game screen. That's something you need to keep into account. There are ways of coding and altering the way your UI is programmed to have it adjust for screen size changes, because not everyone's screen display is going to be the same. But in this case, we're just going to position it manually and assume my game screen's always going to be the same size. Now, this new text thing that I've got here, if I select my text, just like I do with any Unity object, I now have access to all of those same controls that I've been using for moving things around. And I can actually drag this. And as you can see down here in my game window, dragging it on the canvas in my scene view is in fact moving it over the screen. And it's positioned relatively where you see. So I put it in the upper left of my canvas object here. It's now in the upper left. It's very difficult to read, so let's maybe change the color of it. Over in text here, you have a lot of different options. Vertex color is one of them. This opens up our color wheel. And let's just pick a nice, easy to view color, maybe something that looks like a good thing. Green seems like a score, maybe a yellow. Let's make it yellow. Nope, let's not make it yellow. Let's make it green. There we go. And if you type in this text box, I can make it say, hello. It will change exactly what's on the screen. For our purposes now, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it saying new text. Or maybe, in fact, let's just have it say score. So we know this is going to be our score UI eventually, but currently there's nothing in there because the game's not running yet. How are we going to handle that? So for the purposes of keeping track of our score, one thing that you might want to do is have some object, some script that's actually tracking at any given time what the score is and then updating our UI. I'm going to go ahead and make a new empty game object, and I'm going to call it my score manager. I created an empty object up here that I'm just nesting my managers under so I can minimize them to just get them out of my way as I'm looking at my hierarchy. You don't have to do that, but it's just kind of nice for organizational purposes for my sake, since they don't have physical embodiments anyway in the scene. So now we have a score manager, and we're going to want to give it a script to actually do the managing of the score. Name that score manager as well. Why not? So I'm actually going to make one other change. Normally, I would be totally happy leaving my score manager object to be named the same thing as my score manager script. But for now, I'm going to call this score manager object, OBJ, just to differentiate them, because we're going to be using both of them simultaneously in code in a little bit, and I want it to be clear which one is which. But it's totally fine to have those named the same things, and if I was just making these for myself, that's probably what I would do. So looking at our score manager script, what do we need to do to keep track of the score in the game? Well, first thing we might want is we probably want a variable to keep track of what our score is at any given time. So I'm going to make a private instance variable, type integer, because we're going to have only whole number scores, and we'll just call it score. Then in the start method, I'm going to initiate it to the value it's meant to be at the very beginning of the game, which in this case is 0. Now, we want to actually display this score, so let's not even worry about updating it yet. Let's start out by just having some way to make our current score show up in the UI and make sure we can do that successfully. To do that, we need access to the actual text field, because we have to tell the text field what the score is and tell it to update the text. So I'm going to make a public instance variable. I don't want it to be a game object in this case. And you're going to need to do this using TM Pro up here. That imports the library. Remember how we had to do that import for TextMesh Pro? Using TM Pro will give this script access to all of the classes defined inside of TextMesh Pro. So now that I have that, I'm going to make a new public instance variable of type TextMesh Pro UGUI, UGUI. That's just kind of the name for the object type that I'm going to be interacting with to update our text field. And I'm going to name that score text. I like to keep my public and private instance variables separate just so I can see how I'm managing those. And now that we have our score, what we're going to want to do is update that text field to list that score. Since we have access to a text field object, that has a method called setText. And let's just set the text to score : plus whatever our current score is. In C# you can do this. This will just add your score to the string, just string concatenation, easy enough way to do it. And let's just see if this works. So in theory, what should be happening now is when we start running the game, it'll set our score to 0, and then it'll set our score text to this. To get that to actually work, I have to tell our score manager. So score manager object needs to have the score manager script, and that needs access to this text field, which is this one right here. Drag and drop, and now it knows about it. So if I run, there you go. You can see that down here in the game, I'll run that one more time. It starts out just saying score, and when I run it, now our score is 0. So we know that our score manager can interact with our text field to update the score display. What's the next thing we want to do? Well, we need to actually know when we've scored, because if I run it now, it shows the score, but I never really gain any more score. So there are a lot of different ways we could do this. We could measure our score by saying, okay, if one of our hurdle objects gets past the player, we know they've gone far enough that they've scored successfully, add 1 to the score. Just to kind of do something a little bit more fun, I'm going to open up our prefab here for the hurdle. And you've seen before that these objects have these colliders applied to them. When you add a cube especially, by default it has this box collider. Other things may have sphere colliders or even mesh colliders. If you've imported a GameObject, it might have one fit to its shape. Model, I should say, not GameObject. But there's no reason you only need to have one box collider. So I'm actually going to add another box collider component. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make this a trigger. So it won't actually hit our player and interact with them. They'll pass through it, but it'll run any trigger code when the player passes through it. And there's also this Edit Collider button on here. So since we have 2, if I click Edit Collider, and I drag this one back, you can see I'm editing the right one here because these numbers are changing, and drag it up. So what I'm actually doing here is I'm creating this little zone that if the player passes through it, it'll detect that, and I'll be able to run that as trigger code. So now that I have that applied to my prefab, it is a trigger. And I can go back into my obstacle controller code, which you haven't really seen before. In fact, let's not do that. Let's do it in player controller. So in player controller, I'm now going to call the method. I'm going to implement the method on trigger enter. So on collision enter, we're checking if we've collided with the ground, if we can jump again. On trigger enter, we're now going to check and see if we've passed through that score zone. But how do we actually score? So in order to do this, we need to get access to our score manager. And we have to tell our score manager that we have scored. So let's go back over to our score manager now, and let's give it a method. We want some code in here that is accessible from outside of the score manager script. So we want it to be public. It probably doesn't need to return anything. It doesn't need to respond to the player when they've scored. So void, no return value. And let's name it add score. And then it needs to take in one value. I guess it doesn't necessarily. If we know we're always going to be adding 1 point, you can ignore this. But I'm going to go ahead and let it take in an integer number of points, because that way if for some reason we ever changed our game in the future and we wanted to make the number of points variable, say there were more difficult obstacles, or eventually the game speeds up and you want them to score more per thing they jump over, you'd be able to pass in different values here and change how much the score updates by. Well, what do we want to do when we add the score? First thing, let's just add the point value to our score. If you haven't seen it before, this plus equals points is the same thing as saying score equals score plus points. It's just a shorthand way of saying that. Basically, it's saying whatever our current value of score is, add points to it and save it back into score. So now our score has been updated. And let's just go ahead and steal this line from up here. I could put it in a different method, but you know what? We're just going to go ahead and do that. And now, every time we tell the score manager that we have scored some more points, it's going to add those to our score and then update our UI to say what that score is. Don't want to go back quite yet. In our player controller here, we now have onTrigger enter code. So let's say when it passes through the trigger, well, again, we need access to our score manager. Score manager as a script is actually a data type that we can use as our type for a variable inside of our code. So let's add another instance variable here of type score manager. Call that one SM. Put it up there. So for our score manager, now that we have that, it should have access to the add score and then give it a number of points. We're just going to say it's 1 every time for now. So now we should be able to tell our score manager, all right, we entered a trigger, add 1 point. The problem is we haven't ever actually assigned anything to that score manager. We could go into our UI, we could make it a public variable, we could drag and drop our score manager, but we're going to get a little bit more clever with how we do this. Similar to how there's a get component. So this get component method here is saying, find the rigid body belonging to this GameObject. What we want to do now is we want to say, find the GameObject named score manager object. There are multiple ways you can search in your scene for objects that already exist. We're just going to search by name because we know it's called score manager object. So we're saving a new variable of type GameObject. It's the score manager object, and it's actually just a method on GameObject class itself. Find score manager object. So what this has done is we've said, in the current scene, find me the object named score manager object and save it here. We're close. That doesn't quite give us access to the actual score manager component, which is the script that has all of the code for doing our updating. So the one last thing we have to do is we now have to find that. And similar to this get component call here, looking for the rigid body, we can actually search for the component on other objects as well. In this case, SM objects, let's say score manager equals SM object dot, there's our get component call again, of type score manager. So I'll add a comment to that too. This is get the score manager script slash component on from SM object. So now our score manager should be saved into this instance variable called SM, and we should be able to down here tell it, hey, add 1 to my score. Let's go see if it works. So we wait for it to spawn. There it is. We jump. Score equals 1. Score equals 2. And it seems like things are working all right. If we wanted to play around with tags a little bit more, maybe there are other things in our game that have triggers, it's probably worth doing something like going into our hurdle and giving it a new tag called obstacle. So you now have the obstacle tag, and now similar to what we did for the ground, in our code we could say on trigger enter if other dot GameObject dot compare tag, if it has the obstacle tag, then we add a score. So just an extra layer of security in case your game gets more advanced, it starts expanding, you have other triggers and you don't want to score a point for every single trigger. Always kind of good to be a little bit more careful about like what are you actually passing through. So at this point we have basically what we want to have. We have the core components. It would just be making it flashier, making scenery scroll by in the background, adding more obstacles. We're not going to worry about changing the speed yet. That'll come up in a different lab in the second semester of this course. But now you have a way of displaying a score. So for your final project games, having some component of UI is probably a good part of making a game more advanced. You can see that I'm not deleting any of these objects because I took a shortcut on that code. Let's do just one more thing. Maybe we want to trigger some kind of game over. We want to make a UI appear to say, hey, you hit a thing, you lost the game. I'm just going to go ahead in that case and add another text field to our canvas. So select the canvas, add UI, Text Mesh Pro. And we can name these like we did before. So I'm going to call this one score text. And we're going to call this one game over text. And now our game over text, let's just go ahead and make it say what we want to, which is game over. Let's make it nice and red so it feels very threatening because you don't want to lose. And just throw it somewhere in the middle of our screen, somewhere nice and visible. There are ways to position it through code, but I'm just going to kind of eyeball it. That looks pretty good to me. But we don't want it to display at the beginning because this would kind of be very confusing in a game if I ran it and it already just says game over on the screen. Another thing we have access to is when I have this highlighted, this checkbox to the left of the name actually activates and deactivates any game object. So let's have it inactive from the start. Then in our code, so in this case, I'm actually going to come back over to our score manager object, and we're going to go ahead and give it another method. It's public, doesn't need to return anything, and I'm just going to call it game over. And we're going to let our score manager handle making the game over text appear if the game's been lost. Typically, I'd probably do this in some other class, something like a game manager that handled scene transitions and level changes and restarting, things like that. But for now, since this game is so simple, we're just going to throw it in Score Manager. And all this one needs to do is we need to give it access to another text field. In this case, though, this is kind of odd. Our game over text, I'm actually going to make it a game object. Despite the fact that it is a text field, we don't want to be interacting with the actual text. We want to be enabling and disabling the game object that contains it. So I'm just going to make it a game object here. And then all we need to do is, we're assuming that it's inactive at the beginning. Game over text is a game object, and game objects have a method called setActive that takes a Boolean for either true, make it active, or false, make it inactive. It's inactive now, so if we've lost, let's make it true. What we need to do then is we actually need to go into our player controller because it's the one that's going to detect a collision. And remember I put that tag on here for obstacle? This is where it's good we have those tags now because if I collide with the ground, I want to be able to jump again. But if I collide with something that has the obstacle tag, instead, what I want to do is I want to call Score Manager game over, which should make our game over text appear and indicate that we've lost the game. Let's try it and see if it works. We run it. 3 seconds later, it spawns. We jump over one, and then we get hit by the second. Didn't work because I never assigned the variable, which is why it's giving me this error down here. The fun of live coding. Okay, here's our game over text. Here is our score manager object. It needs access to the game over text, which is this right there. That should work a little better. And boom, game over. So there you go. There's the basics of UI. You can add more fields to it, and this is a bit more of a complex interaction between the code than we've done in the past. This is the first time we've really started linking between classes. So it's a little bit more complicated, but hopefully this gives you enough of a review that it makes a little more sense this time around. The big important thing to remember is that those public methods, private means you can't access it outside the class. Public means you can. If I went to the right one, there we go, public. And then the other big important thing that we did this time around was in the player controller using this new GameObject.find method to track down a game object in our scene and then get a component off of it. And with that, that's the end of Lab 3. It's not a very exciting infinite runner, but with this only being 2 class periods going into our final project, this should hopefully give you what you need to know in order to add UI to your final project. Thank you for watching and hope you got something out of this. If you have any questions, send them my way. And yeah, see you next semester.